Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Upskilling Your Workforce Virtually. So glad you could join us today for our panel discussion this afternoon, this morning, wherever you're located. We have gathered three wonderful leaders across the government sector who will be sharing their stories today with you related to how they've maintained a culture of learning, driven upskilling in their workforce and engagement with their employees through such an incredibly challenging time as it's been for all of us over the last 18 months. And I'm very excited to be with you today. If we could move to our next slide, I'm going to go through an introduction of our speakers. We'll talk a little bit about the key questions and objectives we're going to be covering today. So without further ado, I'm your moderator, Chris Schuster. I'm a managing director with KPMG, as you can see on the slide. I've got about 22 years of learning in the human capital advisory, upskilling, talent management, and learning space. So I started when I was 10, your guess is correct. And with me today is this wonderful panel. We'll go ahead over to Reed and ask Reed to introduce herself.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Reed Walsh, and I'm the Deputy Secretary for Human Resources and Management in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, or a CHRO, sort of broadly as we're termed. I'm happy to be with you today. I've been in this position for about 5 years, and we're doing a lot in the name of development. Obviously, transition to telework is a big thing for us. So I'm looking forward to sharing with you some of the things that we've done in the Commonwealth.
Wonderful. Thank you, Reed. Glenn?
Yes, how is everybody? My name is Glenn Fusen. I am the Executive Director of the Governor's Office of Crime Prevention, Youth and Victim Services here in the state of Maryland under Governor Hogan. Been here for about 6 years when Governor Hogan came into office. And before that, I worked in the federal space in drug and gang, anti-drug and anti-gang enforcement. So happy to be here.
Thanks so much, Glenn, and welcome. Steve?
Hi, good day, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here today. I'm Steve Coons. I am the Deputy Chief Financial Officer for the Department of Commerce within the federal government. I am very excited to be here because part of my background or role that I am playing on the Federal Chief Financial Officer Council, I am the chair of the Workforce Modernization Executive Steering Committee. And so I'm looking forward to being able to talk to everyone about what we've done in commerce and my experiences, as well as what the overarching Chief Financial Officer community within the federal government is doing as far as working virtually. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks, Steve, and welcome. If we can go to our next slide, I'll quickly review our agenda for our discussion. We've just been through our intros. We'll go through our learning objectives in a moment. I'll set the stage a little bit. We're going to answer these key questions today in our discussion. How does your organization maintain a culture of learning in a virtual environment? And how did you overcome any challenges? That's a very large question. We'll try and get all the headlines and highlights from our esteemed speakers. And then we're going to talk a little bit about going forward, what do we think the most critical skills are going to be that the workforce will need to stay focused, especially in what in many ways will be a very different new normal in terms of returning to work. We'll leave some time at the end for a wrap up in Q&A, which we'll monitor through the chat. And we're really looking forward to a robust discussion with some ideas and concrete steps about what you can do in your organization and what's next. As we move to our next slide, we'll talk a little bit about our learning objectives here, and I'll go over these with you. I think, by the end of this session, it'll be clear for you to be able to describe the three overarching challenges in managing a virtual team, as many of us are doing now, either as members of a team, managing one, or both, in terms of those key areas of communication, trust, and productivity. We'll explain how managers set the tone, really, and do lead by example to build that culture that's needed to support continual upskilling and learning. We're going to talk about lessons learned. I will do as little talking as possible after this intro to really hear from our experts as they have been dealing with had to deal with the shift to remote work and are now looking at more of a hybrid return to work in many cases, but not all. And then we'll talk a little bit about, again, some of those lead practices. You'll be able to identify those from a cultural learning perspective. And then ultimately, hopefully be able to have an idea of how to leverage various sort of virtual tools for, as in communication or collaboration platforms, much like the one we're on now, right? Or a team session or something like that. So as I set the stage really quickly, and before we ask that first question, there's an anecdote that I want to share that I think tells a story. I think everyone has said, well, we're never really going back to the way it was before the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the things that illustrates that, just from think about a human capital, traditional, I'll call it private sector company, Ford Motor Company, right? This is a well-established brand in our lives and a company that's been around for a number of years. Ford Motor Company recently announced a change in their return to work. So they have approximately 50,000 US employees. And at one time, they only had about a couple of hundred that had the occasional flexibility to work from home prior to the pandemic. They had just announced recently that they will allow up to 22,000 of employees, not allow, they've redesigned the work of 22,000 of their employees to work either fully remotely or in a hybrid way. That is a significant shift, obviously, and a bit of a harbinger, I think, or bellwether of the type of change that we see happening in the private sector as organizations are returning to work. Similarly, we've had a number of conversations with our state and local and federal clients, and you're going to hear some of those stories, I think, today about how work is being reimagined and reconsidered. And so, without further ado, I want to get into our first question. And that really is, and we're going to go to Steve for his answer and move to our next slide. But that, as we dig into that first question, we're really, again, trying to revisit, how did your organization maintain a culture of learning in a virtual environment? And how did you overcome any challenges? And I apologize, moderator mistake. Let's call it Moderator Monday. So we have two polling questions we're also going to ask today. So you can see that there's are we doing the polling question, or did we move to the first slide? Apologies here. I think we've got a little bit of a disconnect. My apologies. I think we're going to go, can you go up one slide, please, moderator Laura, for me? Let's go back, and I want to talk about this first question. Okay, I think we've launched the poll. So go ahead and answer the question. What do you think are the biggest future skills and competency challenges for the FM workforce? And we'll give this some time for folks to answer. And sorry for the out of order slides. That's my fault. My apologies. So you're seeing a really, this is interesting how these numbers have moved over the course of the conversation. We started out with new technology being one of the largest answers, and now, I think, not surprisingly, we're starting to see a little more balance around virtual workplace, and certainly the use of data and analytics. What I'd like to do, Laura, if we can, is go back up a slide when we can. Great. And I'm going to hand it over to Steve for that answer again to the first question, which, just to reiterate for folks, is how did your organization maintain its culture of learning in a virtual environment and overcome any challenges that arose during that time? We'll go to Steve, and then we'll hear from other speakers as well. Steve?
All right, thank you very much, Chris. Answering my question with with my background in two different areas. The first one is going to be as my role as the Deputy Chief Financial Officer for the Department of Commerce. And then my second perspective is going to be helping the Chief Financial Officer Council manage the Workforce of the Future working group as we are trying to see what the future of work is as we are putting together our workforce strategic plan for 2030. And we were developing that strategic plan during this whole virtual environment pandemic situation. It's been over the past 18 months. And our strategic plan actually took the motto of what you see at the top of the screen, which is the future of work is now. It's actually happening. So to answer some of the questions about what it's like what the challenges and opportunities are working in a virtual workspace, some of the challenges are the teamwork, collaboration, and technology. Those are the things that you need to actually not take for granted as we have done when you're in a workspace where you're co-located with your teammates. Working in that environment, it's very easy for you to just jump over to talk to somebody. Now you need to just make the effort. You need to pick up the phone or get on a Teams call or get on a Zoom call. It just doesn't happen as naturally. And so that's one of the major challenges, which affects teamwork and collaboration. And so those are the things that you need to be focusing on as you're working in this quote future of work, which is now. But the benefits of the virtual working are the opportunities that this brings. It brings, I think, many of us would agree, in a better work-life balance. Most of us are, for those of you who are in the Washington metropolitan area, you're not spending 90 minutes in your car or in another form of transportation. You also see a stronger desire, at least I have seen within the Department of Commerce, stronger desire to show that you can have good productivity. And so we've had great increases in our productivity, which has allowed us within the Department of Commerce to actually have our best financial statement audit we have had in the 22 years that we have done our financial statements, all of which have been in the past 22 years getting a unmodified or clean opinion. And we continue that even having all of our workers working remotely. And then finally, I think the other opportunity that you see with the virtual workforce is that it has forced innovation. It has forced us to look at things differently and not actually accept being in the box. That same old way that we've always done things. It has opened up opportunities for us to explore what are better ways for us to be able to deliver the same level of service, same data analytics, or even improve those data analytics by leveraging the technology that we've not necessarily had to leverage, but now have been forced to leverage. Moving on to the next area, leveraging our past experiences and preparing for our future ones. So what I mean by that is that you should take your experiences in how you have to focus on teamwork, how you need to leverage your technology and infrastructure platforms, and be prepared for that moving into the future, because there are going to be other things happening, hopefully no more pandemics, but there will be other stresses on our work environment that we will now be a little bit more nimble and more flexible and able to be prepared for. And you should be using those past experiences to be able to make yourself ready for what is coming in the future. And then finally, I just wanted to touch on quickly the challenge being, or I guess another challenge being, is the IT infrastructure demands, and you need to be ready. I think a lot of us were ready to a certain degree because we had some level of telework and some level of remote working opportunities. But we saw an initial surge in our capacity because that infrastructure was not necessarily as built out as it could have been for 100%. It was dealing with people being at 25 to 50% remote work and during a telework on any given day, and then all of a sudden overnight, from a Friday to a Monday, we were basically doing 100% remote work. And so what that just means is that you need to make sure that you're constantly checking, working with your chief information officer organization to ensure that you've got the appropriate infrastructure needs available, so that way you can still be that high-performing financial management organization that most of us are used to being when we're in the, quote, old normal, and now as we move into the new normal. So with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Chris.
Yeah, Steve, great summary. Thanks for hitting those. And I'll move to Reed for a response to that question as well. Please lend what you'd like. And Glenn, and as you and Glenn respond, we have a question as well that we're going to revisit after this about how should leadership not fall back to status quo pre-pandemic of leading their staff, right? Because we're through maintain and support in many ways. We're transforming now. What's going to prevent us from moving back to the old way? So Reed, going back to the original part of the question, where did you want to wade in?
Yeah, I think this time during the pandemic really gave us a chance to do readiness assessment, more so than we probably ever would have done if we were transitioning to some sort of hybrid environment, or frankly, taking on any new initiative. How ready were we? And so we had this amount of time, regardless of kind of when you were transitioning from, being out of at your home full time back into the office. we all had an extended period to say, okay, let me take a good hard look at my organization, where when I look at the things that have already been mentioned in terms of communication, employee environment, technology, where am I ready and where am I not ready? It's going to be different for all of you. I saw some things in my organization in terms of even just really core things like paper processes. So my employees were very enthusiastic about telework, but did we have a shared drive? Did we have common documents? All these really micro things are the strong core of you to really take a good assessment of those. So I think one of the benefits that we saw from this, if you chose to engage in it, it's not too late now, is to go through those areas and be very intentional and very honest with yourself about where you are in terms of that readiness. So, in terms of what employees do or don't want to do, you have the ability to support it from an infrastructure experience. So if you have a poor communication culture before COVID started, when you transition to a workspace that's more hybrid in nature, you're going to carry that with you. So identifying those areas of win and those areas that you can really make some improvements are really important. And one of the things that I realized is that I really needed to be intentional about what I was asking my staff and my management to do and how they were participating in these activities, so we could be very intentional about setting these things up. If you have people trying to be the communications guru or the spirit cheerleader for the entity and they're still trying to get all their functional work done, does that really work? You need to look at your environment and say, if I need a lot of work here, how do I pull people out to focus on that initiative, spread some of their work out in other places so we can get really strong in this area and kind of contribute to the long game? So that's a lot of the work that we did. I think I'll get into it in a bit. I'm in Pennsylvania, really focusing on our weaknesses and taking some time to make some intentional effort there.
Excellent. Thanks, Reed. I appreciate that. Glenn, what did you want to add in terms of thinking about that first piece about how you try to maintain a culture of learning in Maryland with that virtual environment and really overcome your challenges?
Certainly. Thanks, Chris. I would agree with Steve and with what Reed was saying, that the challenges, we had similar challenges in terms of, I think Reed put it very well, in the micro challenges of paper process. How do we get our mail? We have a lot of mail coming in hard form, and how are we going to address that? But something else that I think that was really important to our organization is realizing that it was more than just moving to a virtual world. We're also dealing with a pandemic, and the mental health challenges that we had to go through with our staff, making sure that our staff were taking care of themselves. Many had elder care challenges, they had child care challenges, they just had mental health challenges of, oh my gosh, what's happening during a pandemic? So I found myself taking on the role of checking in on my staff much more than I might in normal times. Our office is a smaller office. We have about 100 individuals here, and obviously I have a lot of contact with my direct reports, but reaching down into my organization further was more important to make sure that everybody was was okay. And actually adjusting some of the work to life balances. Chris, I think you mentioned that it certainly provides opportunity for work-life balance, but I think that it also provides for that opportunity for people to overwork. You're always at home, that desk is at your house. Maybe I'll just check my emails at 8 o'clock at night instead of watching a movie with the kids. So we really had to spend a lot of time on the mental health side of that with our employees, which is something we touched on. The other thing I would say from our office standpoint, our role is to reach out into the community, into the 6 million Marylanders that are out there, and address crime control issues and victim services and children and youth are our main areas. So we really had to be innovative in how are we going to reach out into that community and find out what their immediate needs are, was one of our biggest challenges. We would do that in the past with large open forums. We go chat, we would go sit down and hear about some of the challenges. So we had to reinvent that. And we'll talk about some of the new process in the next section. But obviously the IT infrastructure demands were great there for us. So, we had the one challenge in our office, but the other challenge was reaching the community. How are we going to reach a depressed community throughout the state if they didn't have IT, didn't have computers, didn't have Wi-Fi, didn't have the some of the things that we may all take advantage of or take for granted in our at-home work environment. So we really had an immediate need to educate our staff on how are we going to reach the public and find out about immediate needs of our law enforcement friends, our victim service partners, and our children and youth. And it was really interesting that in all of those scenarios, IT infrastructure really was a big challenge for them. And then we had to turn our attention to supporting that by providing IT infrastructure to them. But then also with some of our victims providers and the like, counseling services, child services, getting folks away from abusers. We learned a lot in terms of how dependent we are in-person interaction in our community. So I think that was a big lesson for us.
Yeah, Glenn, I mean, so, and really thanks to all three of you. There's just so much meat on the bone there. I'm looking forward to the next part. The next question, which we're going to ask, is really about what's going forward in terms of our next discussion topic, I should say. But I think what you hit on at the end there that I think was so critical, and we've seen this, I think, both in our firm and with our clients from a cyclical standpoint. We're always reassessing, right? Through this whole process, we've been reassessing. And in many ways, we're reassessing the way work gets done, the IT infrastructure that's needed to get it done, our policies and procedures. But this other piece that I think has often been recycled through the conversation is, what is the well-being of our employees? And asking that in a way that maybe we weren't asking it exactly in the past. And I think when you talk about skills for frontline managers that they may or may not have, lots and lots of experience with, is this notion of understanding how to check in on employees' mental health and well-being, and what the sort of ways to go about taking care of our people in a different way, which we weren't able to do because we're not just virtual for no reason. We were virtual because of a pandemic that caused a lot of tragedy, frankly, right? And a lot of upheaval and disruption and mourning in some respects. And so I think there is this whole other set of skills that are part of a conversation now that they haven't been in a different way. What I'd like to do, if I could, is we had went forward to our poll for the first poll, and that's okay. Let's go ahead forward in slides. And, when we go back to our polling question for just a second, because I wanted to just show the question. We don't have to show the results. It's fine. Oh, there they are. Beautiful. Thank you. That worked out perfectly. What do we think are the biggest future skills and competency challenges? And we ask questions mainly here related to infrastructure, analytics, technology skills, etc. You see here where the information is kind of shaken out, right? Almost half have said new technology, because these new ways of working are requiring us to be able to work in Zoom, WebEx, Teams, GoToMeeting. I mean, so many different virtual collaboration platforms, and to do it and not drop the delivery of our services, right? Plus, many organizations have had to put new technologies in place to provide self-service, like applications like ServiceNow for our employees. Those are good examples. So, all right, so what we're going to do now, and this kind of tees up that next question, and I'll ask it really to tease up the next discussion question, not our poll question, that's coming. The next discussion for question, or topic for discussion, and we'll go to you, Reed, as you think about looking forward, right? What are those sort of most critical skills that the workforce will need to stay successful? And I think we're telling kind of both stories here of what we had to do to identify those and where we think they're going. So go ahead, if you could, and move forward a slide. There you go. And go ahead, Reed, please.
Yeah, so this slide is some of the thoughts that I put together in my organization, and what I'm seeing in terms of HR service to others and things that we're asking of ourselves, and then what are kind of these intentional movements that we're going to make to get there. But one thing really that I thought of, that in terms of employees, when I heard about, new ways of doing this, new ways of doing that, I think one benefit, to say there was one, to a pandemic was maybe sparking creative thoughts and needing to invent things and not just follow a process. And I know in my own organization, I reached into all facets of the organization because of what was going on with the pandemic for support support here, opening up leadership conversations to people I would not necessarily be interfacing with. And I think the result of that was a really positive environment where people really felt like they were invested in the things that we're doing, whether it's like, okay, let's figure out a new way to do this, or needing to quickly pivot and learn a new technology, get better in teams, get better in X, Y, and Z. And I saw a lot of momentum and energy in that. And I think one of the things that we need to do in terms of leadership is seize on that moment, because I do think, out of all the dire consequences, there is some energy coming from employees. They see kind of their world of possibilities, from what they used to do going to here. And I think developing that growth mindset and getting them excited about engagement is going to be a really important thing for us to do as leaders. And I think the way that we do that, again, is being really real about our work environment and where we need to progress things and make them more interesting and engaging for our employees. And one of the things I hear from my own leadership and from the agencies I serve in terms of HR services is we really need our employees to be more consultative. Just don't tell me what that procedure is, but if you see that I'm struggling with step A, give me a little background on the policy. Why is it like that? Because for some reason as a leader, I'm going to need that information to get me to do that practical next step. So I think it's about getting access to knowledge. We're really concentrating on training and making it a requirement for all of my leadership to participate in training sessions. We're doing them via site on SharePoint. We're hosting the trainings live. We're keeping them recorded. We're rotating topics. People can engage in them, when they need to, or if they want to be part of the energy of the group discussion, that's great. But that is a requirement for me with my staff to be giving opportunities for learning and stretch assignments. So, and a really real conversation I had to have with my staff is if I'm always going to tell you, but if I'm going a couple levels below you to engage one of your employees in a project, because that's healthy for the organization. And I think kind of changing that mindset on who we're pulling in for activities and how we're engaging people, not just your go-tos, because they'll get it done and they'll be great. Maybe pulling someone else in and having that go-to be their mentor, things like that, and making people be able to provide that consultativeness really comes with the experience of doing things. So intention there is huge for us. Improved communication. Again, this needs to be something that if you prioritize this, and I used to work for a media company, I find communication to be extremely important. You need to organize your daily activities around it. What are you as a leader doing to communicate? How are you asking your leaders to communicate? And what kind of platforms are you setting up to do that? And I found in my organization, it was really important for me to set aside someone's full-time job to be championing it, engaging it, and even having champions for communication that's not their full-time job. They're out kind of in the functional areas, but there are champions for our comms, and we rely on them to be writing articles and posting them to our site. And then again, kind of bringing that full circle. So my requirement for my leaders is they go into that site and read and engage. And I had to require that to drive the behavior, and hopefully it'll become second nature soon. But I really do think it is about setting the culture and being very intentional about what you're doing. One of the things that I always give myself a little slap on the hand for is we've been very focused on standardization of activities so we can measure, right? So time to hire was the big thing when I first took this position. The time to hire is way too long. I said, well, does anybody measure it? Like, how do we know? And from agency to agency, can we compare time to hires? And so we did a ton of work standardizing, be able to pull the data into sections, visualizing the data that our customers can go into Power BI and see how long their hiring actions are taking and who they're sitting with where. And I have it out there and it's great. When I'm talking to my own leadership group, I'm not using that as a tool. So all these things that I'm promoting and asking of my staff, my customers to participate in, how much am I using it as kind of like a core tenet of how we're operating, not just when I need to solve a problem. And that's something that I know that we need work with within my ranks in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So collecting the data, having the data available, making it really accessible is one thing, really understanding how you use it and being able to pivot. So if you create something where the data is not as important as you thought it would be to the conversation, how do you go to the next level with that? I think always constantly re-examining those types of projects in the data space is really important. What do your customers really need? And feel free to interrupt me anytime, Chris, but successful remote working, and this came up with the other speakers, it's readiness, it's IT infrastructure. So I said to my employees, my direct reports in particular, I don't care when you're here because we can all connect like this. So some people can be here in person and some people can be remote. And then I looked at my environment that I was actually going to do those meetings. I'm like, well, I don't have a camera in my large meeting room. So how am I really doing this? So immediately it was like, you said you're going to have this environment, put the camera in the room so people can be there remote and they can be there in person. It's those little things that you need to do to support the actual working environment you're planning for. And they don't get done unless, leadership and management is driving those little things that help support kind of what you're preaching in terms of your new environment. And it goes a long way to show employees that you really are supporting those things that you're trying to give them in terms of work-life balance and being able to participate, even if they're on their remote workday and such. So I think that's a big part of what we're doing. I think we're going to find more lessons as we go. I only know what I know right now in terms of what we need to do, and to keep a constant monitor on that, in particular for the next 2 to 3 years, because we all know it takes a bit of time sometimes to plan for some of those major projects. And then better work processes. We're always trying to figure out a way to be more efficient. I, in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, am constantly seeing my compliment cap go down. And I think there's really good reason for that, because technology is getting better. We're getting better at our processes. But as I'm doing that, am I designing it in a vacuum? And kitchen cabinets for me, where I'm taking my colleagues who are other deputies in the business areas and saying, can you look at this? Is this helpful for you? I pretty much do it for every major thing that I'm launching. If I'm doing a display of diversity data, can you navigate this? If I'm doing telework, which we were launching before COVID hit and then continued to launch it, what do you think about this approach for this? Is this helpful to you? That emphasis on your colleagues and what they need from you and reaching across those agency lines or entity lines is extremely important. And it takes a lot of work. But I find that, find the people who want to engage, and it pays off in dividends. And so those are some of the real practical things we're doing on the ground. I think it's a lot of, like I said there in the slide, being very intentional about those things that from a culture perspective really move the needle.
Additional knowledge sharing opportunities, etc. Before we go to that, though, I'd love to hear Steve and Glenn chime in as well. When you think about, as you're moving forward, and thank you, Reed, that, recognizing how much all of us have had to really adjust to address this. But as we're looking forward, what are those most critical kind of skills and, that the workforce will need to stay successful? And so Steve and Glenn, what would you share in reaction to that question?
I'll jump in first. I would say I can't agree more with what Reed has said. It's all about being intentional. To address one of those questions, Chris, that you had mentioned at the beginning about, how do you make sure that leaders don't fall back to what they were doing pre-pandemic? I think intentional is the perfect word for that. I mean, you need to coach your leadership team to ensure that they understand that if you want to call it the new normal, that's fine, but it's not the normal of the pre-pandemic. And you need to understand that we have a different way of communicating now. We have a lot more tools at our disposal, which I think are all great because they enhance productivity, they enhance the ability to have better teamwork if used correctly. And in some cases, as Reed pointed out, so long as you've got that camera in the right spot, you can actually leverage it for a hybrid workforce where you can have 5 people in the office around a conference table. You get this camera so that the people who aren't in the office can see everybody at the table. And those are things that need to be intentionally thought through from an IT standpoint. And quite frankly, I'll end with this, that it's very easy for people to fall back on their old habits. I'm not saying they're bad habits. I'm not even going to say they're good habits. It's just the way things were. And you need to actually think, as you're starting to go back, you need to, again, I love this word, Reed, you need to be intentional about your thoughts and to decide, is this something that I really should be doing the way I did it before? Or based on, technology, location, as Glenn pointed out, having to be more interactive with some of your employees just because they have a different personality trait, and that's how you used to do that in the office. You just didn't notice it because that's just you were physically there. And so you just need to be intentional about those things and figure out what makes the most sense.
Yeah, great points all, Steve. I appreciate that. Glenn, what did you want to say really in addition to that?
I think that, again, I think I agree with Steve and what Reed was saying as well. I think if I had to pick out specific skills, though, adaptability and collaboration are certainly skills that we need to carry forth, both in our leadership, but also in our ranks and files in our organizations, that we need to be adaptable to the environment. I think that COVID taught us that, right? Someone pointed out that we left work on Friday and we didn't come back on Monday. And that caught a lot of people by surprise, and we needed to make sure we're adapting to that, and we have to adapt to our staff needs. I hope that it also taught us that, sometimes we have policies and procedures in place for a reason, and I certainly believe with them, but we also need to revisit those policies and procedures to make sure that they're not antiquated, that they're not written 30 years ago, and are just there in place because no one's looked at them since. I know that one of the trending questions right now is generational differences. I think that's another spot that we have to really look at. Some of our older workers may not be as comfortable on a computer as some of the younger, or vice versa. And I think that we really need to make sure that we as leaders and that our second line leaders are talking to their employees, figuring out how they work best, how they're most productive, and adapting work to meet them. I don't think that means that we just refresh the work environment. I think that means that we have to adjust our work to meet the needs of our workers. I think the other thing that we have to look at, as we move forward, I've heard the term the Great Resignation being used as this time in place, and the amount of people that are resigning from organizations that are not adapting and changing the paradigm is great. And I think that goes back to the adaptability that we have to have as leaders in organizations.
Yeah, Glenn, all great points. In fact, generationally, the term silver tsunami is being used for retiring baby boomers. I'm a Gen Xer myself. Then about 50% of the workforce now is composed of millennials and Gen Z, right? And we know as leaders, we have to recruit those employees too. So there's a whole different set of conversations that we're having in a way that also talk about another question that's come up in the chat through this session as well, which is related to how do we get employees who are resistant to these new ways of working or technology to adapt it? And I think we've heard that in many ways. Feel free to respond and go ahead if you could to the next slide. We're going to go through a couple more slides to talk through some additional content. Reed, I'll come back to you in a moment here. But What I always like to say to folks is, it can be, this whole conversation can be very academic and very complicated for good reason, right? So oftentimes as leaders, I think we want to simplify and just, when it comes to new ways of working and new technologies, and just shoot for two things. Really simple, right? And I'd love to hear your reactions on these as well. But one is just reducing the overall anxiety level of your folks. And that's done through constant communication. That's done through checking in at the small group, medium, and large group levels in many ways to let people know you're listening and you're engaged. And Reed, I think you hit on that a number of times as well. And then the second part of that is elevating their confidence to use these tools. And so if you pick strong representatives in your teams across those different generational groups, Glenn, to your point, who are comfortable in these new ways of working and share their stories and ask them to be your kind of champion change network, you get to see the organization help itself lower the overall anxiety and elevate that user confidence, right? So, Reed, I'll come back to you if I could. I know we've got a lot here on this slide and the next one for Steve, I think too. But what are some of the highlights you wanna call out here?
Yeah, sure. I think you're absolutely right. I think resistance is really a reflection of confidence sometimes. And I think some of the things that we've done is one, survey our employees so they can answer this, anonymously and figure out kind of where their pain points are and how they're feeling. Are they feeling insecure? So we'll do some really exact survey questions and just say, generally, how are you feeling right now? And then word cloud it out to them and kind of acknowledge their feelings. We do that at, about twice a year so we can kind of acknowledge what's going on in their environment. And I think that's just a little handy tool to let them know that you're listening, you're looking at that, and then you're telling them things that you're going to do to address that, right? Some of the things we do in terms of the learning is cohort learning. People love to learn in cohorts. They like to come in with people. We're focusing a lot on hiring. So if we have a group of college graduates coming in, we're doing a lot of bringing them in together, training them together, having upper management participate in the program that we're participating in. And we're really finding, what we have found, regardless of what generation is, that really works. We have been doing it here in the Commonwealth for 25 to 30 years. We stopped it. Bringing this kind of cohort leadership next group in. And then we saw that we were kind of lacking in that area. So really focusing on kind of what's coming in and making sure that people are connecting with each other. That's huge. So you're going to have to really build those connection areas and force those connections sometimes. And then it becomes organically. The more you're with people, the more you understand them, the more you're willing to ask them a question that, you may anticipate that makes you come off like you don't know what you're talking about, or you don't have a skill here or there. Kind of the more comfort people have with each other, the more willing they are to learn. And then I want to parlay that into one of the thoughts in the slide is non-traditional credibility sources. So I have someone from a certain area or someone from a certain generation that, it actually really took to X, Y, or Z that I'm trying to do, letting them talk at meetings, letting them go out and do a road trip and talk to their colleagues about how to use X, Y, or Z tool. And maybe it's a non-traditional person that we would have kind of think of our HR trainers or your leadership at the top of the ladder, but someone who just really took to this, engaging them to go out and talk to people about it and, kind of walk them through really simple steps that may be causing some of that lack of confidence and therefore lack of, adapting to new technologies or willingness to change. So it's really about making people feel more comfortable. I mean, during the pandemic, I think all of our shoulders were here, and it's about allowing employees to kind of put their shoulders down, and that'll make them be more open to these new things. So I think, meeting people where they are is really, really important. And those are some of the ways you can do it through different credibility sources, allowing people to consume information in various ways, right? So if they want to join and engage and ask questions, great. If they want to consume it later and come back with a list of questions and have a place to go with them, thinking about who your people are and how they're going to want to engage with you is going to be really important. We set up a site called One HR Connect. It's fairly new to us, so we're really focusing right now on community and collaboration. I did a video where I introduced my telework coworkers, I didn't introduce my family, I introduced my pets because people love animals. And, just kind of like to say, hey, I'm your deputy secretary. There's 900 of us out there. You work in Pittsburgh. I work in, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, but we're all in this together. We're going to connect here. And we have people write articles, and I make an effort to go in there and comment, and people are doing their own videos to introduce themselves. And now we're building in things that people need to know. So, the next time we do, an upgrade to X, Y, or Z, or maybe we're announcing our final telework schedule, we're going to post it there because people are going to want to go and engage in that knowledge content. And then they're going to get a little bit of like, oh, I didn't know what that person looked like. I see their name on emails because maybe they did a profile on themselves. So, that kind of stuff really does make a difference. And I think we've always considered that to be kind of third rail work. And I think it's becoming more important and more relevant to focus on that community thing as we go into this hybrid environment, and probably was relevant before, but we didn't give it the due that it really needed. And now we're kind of forced to, because it's really important to have people identify with people as a person. And so
no, Reed, it's so interesting. That question actually has bubbled up as well, right? Which is, how do we get people to show themselves in video calls, right? So we're going to transition in a second here to Steve to talk a little bit about this from a future of skilled CFO standpoint. But to that question, you gave a great example. Having leaders record even their own videos and introductions and things like that and share them in a common space, that's one way. I've seen all number of things. One of the interesting things we've done, and I've seen some of our clients do, is actually designate days that are non-video call days internally. And so the expectation is that you are on video with your colleagues, and certainly our clients, our citizens, whatever the case may be, if we're engaging virtually, if that's the expectation. But internally, let's designate times when we're not going to be on the calls or not be going to be on video, so people can kind of relax a little and not feel the pressure of being on video. I've also seen people do competitions about fun virtual backgrounds or costume, like any number of different things, or have more casual related virtual events like a casual virtual lunch where people are just hanging out. We may not be comfortable eating in front of you. You get my point. My point is this idea of just designated non-work time where we're not talking about work, we're just catching up, but we're encouraged to be on video to do that. So I've seen a number of those things. As we go to next slide, though, I want to turn it to Steve for a sec and talk a little bit, if you could, about some of what you've been talking about in terms of focus of the CFO of the future now, this whole idea of a future 10-year strategy that needs to be thought of now.
Very good. Sure. This is the work of the Workforce Modernization Working Group. It was cross-functional across all the areas of the federal government. It hit about 12 or 15 different departments. And we did it during this whole pandemic time. We started it 18 months ago, so it was a couple of months before the pandemic started. So we saw each other in person for a couple of meetings, and then all of a sudden we went virtual. And I think you can actually see some of the areas that we need to focus on to be areas that were influenced by the whole pandemic environment, which is, supporting our current workforce. What do they need in order to be able to do their jobs in the future, knowing that the future is going to be an environment that could be hybrid or virtual or in person? And what skills do they need to be able to do that? Recruiting for the future workforce. What are the things that are going to attract either current employees who are in different departments or recent graduates? What are the things that they value, which I think both Reed and Glenn both focused on in earlier conversations, that there are different generational passions and desires that motivate people in order for them to come, and having that workplace flexibility is going to be something that they're going to most likely, in many cases, leverage as far as when they're choosing where do they want to go. Adapting to technology and planning for succession. We need to make sure that we've got the technology in place so that we can work in a hybrid workforce, as well as in some folks who can be 100% remote, as well as planning for our future leaders. We need to understand who are the traits of our future leaders and what do they need to have as being developed so that they can be successful 10 years from now. As I said, working in this virtual environment influenced all of that. The last two are facilitating culture change and building lasting partnerships. That is a recognition of a couple of things. One, that our work environment is changing. It's not the traditional office complex that most of us have been used to and have grown up in. And so the culture of how you operate with your peers and your colleagues is going to be different than what it was pre-pandemic. And then building those lasting partnerships are realizing that it's not just your customers and it's not just your stakeholders, but you need to build relationships with your colleagues in order for you to be that high-performing finance organization of the future. And what I will end with, in the interest of time, is that one of the studies that came out early on, probably 6 months into the pandemic, in which we used to help us in this whole strategic planning process, was that they said the success that companies are seeing is the fact that in the pandemic and being 100% remote work, is the fact that they had already established very strong interpersonal relationships with their colleagues. And that goes back to the previous slides that we've talked about. That is one of the major challenges that we need to continuously figure out as leaders. How do we continue to create those interpersonal relationships that are going to be essential to a high-performing team? Because it's not the same just talking over a video webcam. You need to come up with ways that you're going to actually physically interact, that people will feel safe, and that people will want to learn about each other. As Glenn pointed out, I think it was you, Glenn, having those lunches and such that weren't, just about work. They're just learning about yourselves and who you are and what your passions are. So yeah, I will end with that.
Yeah, Steve, I think that's really strong. And what I want to do is go to the next polling question, but while that's up on screen and folks are answering it, I want to ask Glenn to go ahead and add anything he wanted to add to that last conversation as well.
Well, you know, again, I just go back to what we were talking about with adaptability. We're going to have to be adaptable across all sections and in all environments on how we're engaging with our employees, how we're engaging, in my case, or all of our cases, with our constituents as well. I think is a really big game changer. You know, it's in a way easier to do that in my mind with a controlled environment within the office, but how we're going to engage with our constituents and those that we serve is going to be huge. And as I pointed out, I mean, we talked about technology a while ago, and we talked about, you know, having video conferencing and having that kind of capability, but just the simple thought of Wi-Fi, not having access to that is something that we really need to go down to, and then educating that public. You know, we had the question about intergenerational, but just look at our public population and their comfort and their ability to use technology is going to be a challenge. So I think we have to continue to be adaptable.
Wonderful. Thanks for driving that point home, Glenn. I really want to take a second to thank all of our participants today. Reed, Steve, Glenn, I really appreciate you sharing all the wonderful experiences and leading practices that your organizations have brought. I think this has been, in a short span of time, we've captured a lot of really relevant information folks can take back to work today, if you will. I don't know if we have time. I don't think we do for additional questions to the audience, but the ones that have been upvoted, we've certainly responded to. If there are any others and folks are going to stay on, I'll ask my panelists maybe to stay on for another moment or two. But I do want to thank everybody for their participation today. And again, really, really enjoy the conversation.